bringing you 5 sleepers and 5 studs that you need to be starting in week 10 fantasy football. And the first player we're going to be talking about, it's going to be Sterling Shepard for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And when we're looking at sleepers, I want guys that are going to get a ton of opportunity, to have a ton of upside. And this week, Sterling Shepard is going to be benefited by the fact that we're looking at a second straight game with no Jalen McMillan. Jalen McMillan's been battling a hamstring that kept him out of last week's game. I am projecting that he will probably be out of this week's game according to reports. So we got Sterling Shepard going to be suiting up as most likely the clear number 1 wide receiver for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Now, you're going to say to me, well, Caleb, Cade Otton has been the number 1 receiving weapon. Why are we hyped for Sterling Shepard? Last week, Shepard, he had a 56% route share, a 16.1% target share, 2.5 yards per route run, and a 21% first read share, which means that when Baker took a snap, 1 out of every 5 times he was looking Sterling Shepard's way first. He also had a red zone target, so there's a lot of things that are exciting for Sterling Shepard. Now, granted, last week wasn't the best fantasy football performance by any stretch of the imagination, but when we're looking at sleepers, I want guys that have elite level upside, that are getting the opportunity, that are getting the work. I love some Sterling Shepard right now. I have him projected at 8 fantasy points, which you're going to say to me, Caleb, 8 fantasy points, that is not great by any stretch of the imagination. But when we're looking at sleeper options that you might need to throw in a flex, especially with some injuries, I think Sterling Shepard is a great target for week 10 fantasy football. Now, move on to my second sleeper for week 10. We're going to bring you a tight end sleeper. It's going to be Jonnu Smith for the Miami Dolphins. And Jonnu Smith, since week 8, he's had a 69% snap share, an 18.2% target share, and a 20.8% first read. Absolutely incredible, especially in an offense where you got Tyreek Hill, you got Jalen Waddle, you got Devon out of the backfield. And we know that, of course, in that week 7 game versus Indianapolis, that was the biggest game of his season so far. The last 2 weeks haven't been great, but we're continuing to see hopefully this turnaround of with Tua Tagovailoa coming back into this offense, with them just being able to put together better offensive stretches that's going to benefit Tyreek Hill, Jalen Waddle, Devon, and it's going to open up things for Jonnu Smith. So I understand we're talking tight ends. It's always risky to start any type of tight ends, but if you're super desperate at the tight end position and looking for potentially a streamer or someone to get you over the hump this week, I do think Jonnu Smith is a great option. The next sleeper that I'm going to be talking about today, it's going to be Parker Washington for the Jacksonville Jaguars. And Parker Washington, he was a favorite sleeper last week, did not have the best day versus the Philadelphia Eagles. He did have a 91% route share, a 19.4% target share. We need to see what he's going to be able to do in this week 10 matchup versus Minnesota, which honestly is going to be better than what he did last week, their matchup against Philadelphia. So I do like this a little bit more for Parker Washington. Do have him as sliding in as my wide receiver 50 this week. So you're going to say to me, Caleb, you're providing a sleeper that's wide receiver 50. Yes, I am. But we do know that in the streets right now, you might need somebody to be able to come in on the flex, the back end of a 2 flex format, to be able to help push you over the league, or you're in a deeper format. I do think Parker Washington's a great sleeper target that I would be targeting. Like I said, main reason that snap share has been incredible. We do know Trevor Lawrence is going to be out this week, so they're going to get down to Minnesota pretty early. So I understand having a backup quarterback in there never is looking good for your wide receiver weapons, but if you're going to have to be slinging the rock all over the field just to stay in the game, what the Jacksonville Jaguars have had to do, I do think it provides an okay game script for a guy like Parker Washington to have some success this week. So I definitely think targeting Parker Washington as a sleeper, another great option. Now, we round out with 2 more sleepers. The next guy we're going to be talking about is going to be Nick Westbrook-Ikhine for the Tennessee Titans. And Nick Westbrook-Ikhine has been a favorite sleeper of the fantasy football community for a while, for a lot of seasons. But really, this season, it's kind of been incredible when we look at his last 4 weeks. He has scored a touchdown in all of those games. And really, we see like when he had that first touchdown versus Indianapolis, he only had a 22% snap share. But since then, they have worked him clearly with the trade of DeAndre Hopkins up to being that wide receiver 2 next to Calvin Ridley, where he's getting a 92, 97% snap share. And with those increased snaps, he's getting more targets. And especially with the yards per reception going up, he is getting down the field targets, which is super exciting for Westbrook-Ikhine. And I think when we're looking at this matchup versus the Chargers, it's a very good matchup for Westbrook-Ikhine and Calvin Ridley. I do have Westbrook-Ikhine a spot behind Parker Washington in my wide receiver rankings this week, so I do have Westbrook-Ikhine projected at 8.1 fantasy points. But this dude's been scoring a touchdown each and every game. He's been on an absolute heater on the touchdown department. We know touchdowns can be touchy, so I don't want to just be assuming that we're going to be able to get a touchdown for Nick Westbrook-Ikhine, but I do think we need to be taking into consideration how bad this Tennessee Titans offense has been. They're giving a ton of touches to Tony Pollard. They're targeting Calvin Ridley. They're giving Nick Westbrook-Ikhine touchdowns. Like, there's a lot of still fantasy football value to be had on this offense. So I definitely want to be taking into consideration that when we're looking at our overall sleepers. And my last and final sleeper, it's going to be Tyler Allgeier for the Atlanta Falcons. And Tyler Allgeier is clearly playing second fiddle to Bijan Robinson. Of course, Bijan Robinson got drafted in the overall top 10 picks, pick 7 of last year's draft, and finally really starting to take over the snap share. Tyler Allgeier has been hovering around like a 24 to 35% snap share over the last 3 weeks. He's really a true handcuff in every sense of the word, because we know if he does get volume, Tyler Allgeier can be a really, really great running back. And I think this week, if you're super desperate at the running back position, if you have no options at the RB2 and or a flex spot versus New Orleans, this is an interesting matchup for me. I know he's only played in 25% of snaps the last 3 weeks. So you're going to say to me, Caleb, this feels like an absolute long shot here, but I do like the matchup enough with the fact that I think if the game script with New Orleans, Atlanta's going to get up early. They're going to be able to run the ball a ton in the second half, and that's going to be an extra lot of touches for Tyler Allgeier. So that's kind of my thought process with Tyler Allgeier sleeper. I do like him this week in week 10 if you're super, super desperate for some running back help. But now transitioning from our sleepers to our studs, we're going to be talking about guys. We're not talking about Bijan Robinson, Justin Jefferson by any stretch of being studs. We know that you're starting those studs, but I want to talk about some studs that in my rankings are maybe a little bit higher than maybe the consensus would like to talk about. The first guy is going to be DeAndre Swift this week, and DeAndre Swift and the Chicago Bears are going up against the New England Patriots. I have this as a B+ matchup for DeAndre Swift. Have him projected right now at 17.1 fantasy points. Right now he's the RB16 in points per game, and he's been averaging the 12th most snap share out of all running backs. And when we look at what he's done last week versus Arizona, it was a little bit of a down game. I'm not going to lie. It was a little bit of a down game for DeAndre Swift, as he didn't score a touchdown, only had 16 carries for 51 yards, 3.2 yards per carry, but he did get the 6 targets and the 6 receptions. So in a full PPR format, DeAndre Swift was definitely helping your fantasy football team. I think this week going up against New England, it's very similar of a matchup to like what he went up against in week 8 versus Washington, where I think we could easily be projecting DeAndre Swift to be getting somewhere around, like we said, like 18.2 to 18.4 fantasy points, assuming that he stays fully healthy, assuming that everything plays out the way that I am projecting it in the game script. I don't see how they get super behind or super ahead. I think this will be a pretty close game where DeAndre Swift will be able to get the work. Have DeAndre Swift as a top 12 running back this week. Absolute stud that you need to be starting in your fantasy football roster. The next guy that we're going to be talking about that's going to make this stud list, it is going to be Kareem Hunt for the Kansas City Chiefs. And we don't know how many more weeks Kareem Hunt's going to be able to make lists like this for me, because as much as I've had him on a ton of teams and absolutely loved seeing Kareem Hunt be able to thrive and play, when is Isaiah Pacheco going to be coming back, and how is that going to hurt and impact Kareem Hunt's overall status? Now, going up against the Denver Broncos defense has been one to be one of the better defenses in the NFL this season. But really, since assuming that starting role for the Kansas City Chiefs in week 5, Hunt has been the RB7 in fantasy. He's averaging 25 touches a game, 95 yards. Dude's been an absolute bell cow. And so going forward, I as long as there's no Isaiah Pacheco, I mean, Kareem Hunt's looking like just the dude you always have to start each and every week. And now I do have him right now sliding in as my RB17. So he's a little bit lower just because it's not the best matchup versus Denver. This isn't an A+ matchup. I have this strictly rated as a B matchup, but 15.4 fantasy points is where I'm projecting him, especially if you're getting 25 carries in a Chiefs offense that can throw the ball down the field. They can run the ball down the field. They've been absolutely electric. Maybe not old Chiefs electric, but like they're winning games all the time. So Kareem Hunt is a guy that I'm definitely starting as a stud. Hopefully you are too. The next guy that's going to be a stud this week in week 10 fantasy football, it's going to be George Pickens for the Pittsburgh Steelers. And George Pickens, when we're looking at the wide receiver rankings this week, in full PPR slides as my wide receiver 18. Now going up against Washington, you might say to me, Caleb, George Pickens should be a little bit higher. And if we're looking at how he's performed last week versus the Giants, week 8 versus the Giants wasn't the best, and then week 9 he was on the bye. But week 7 versus the Jets, he did have 9 targets, 5 receptions for 111 yards and 1 total touchdown. Looked absolutely electric. Like we said, he's a wide receiver 36 in points per game right now. The thing that's exciting for me with George Pickens and why I think he's going to be a stud is he's ranked 6th in deep targets and 3rd in red zone targets. And this matchup with Washington, they're going to have to take shots deep. They're going to have to keep up with the Washington Commanders' elite level offense. Now, the part that I understand with this matchup is we got Marshawn Lattimore now added to the cornerback room for the Commanders. So you're going to say to me, if Marshawn Lattimore is on George Pickens, which we're assuming is going to happen, like how much is George Pickens actually going to be able to score? Because we always get scared, like the Mike Evans, Marshawn Lattimore argument. I still very much so like George Pickens. I think he's a stud. I think they're going to have to throw the ball, and he's their best target to go get them the win this week. I think he's an absolute stud that you need to be starting in your fantasy football lineup. Now, we got 2 more studs before we get out of here, but if you haven't already, hit that like and subscribe button on the way to 4,000 subscribers. Next guy we're going to talk about, it's going to be DaVante Adams, and of course, DaVante Adams is a stud. We know this, playing with our guy Aaron Rodgers for the Jets. But this week versus Arizona, I have both Garrett Wilson and DaVante Adams in my top 10 wide receivers for full PPR, and DaVante Adams had his career best game with the Jets last week. I know the bar was pretty low, but he did have a 791 and 1 touchdown stat line. And we understand that there is him playing essentially second fiddle to Garrett Wilson. And I think going forward, as DaVante Adams gets more comfortable, though, well, it'll be interesting to see what those splits start to look like. But last week, like we said, versus Houston, 11 targets, 7 receptions for 91 yards, and a total touchdown. If DaVante Adams can get 10 to 11 targets a game, he is an instantly must start, a top 10 wide receiver, if not top 6. Like I said, right now I have him as a top 8 because we do know, like, can he consistently get that target share? Because in week 8 versus New England only had 6, but versus Pittsburgh he had 9. So if he can consistently get in that top tier of double-digit targets, DaVante Adams is a top 10 wide receiver, especially when he's getting the ball thrown to him by Aaron Rodgers. Absolute stud you need to be starting. And my last and final stud for this week in fantasy football is going to be Cade Otton for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And Cade Otton, top 3 tight end for me going up against San Francisco. As much as we talked about Sterling Shepard being the number 1 wide receiver option, but not being the number 1 on his clear team, I'm going to say this. Cade Otton is the clear number 1. And if this dude can do what he's been doing the last 3 weeks, where Cade Otton, it's actually been incredible. 10, 10, and 11 targets. And those targets have resulted in 8 to 9 receptions and 1 to 2 touchdowns in each of these games. Cade Otton is becoming an absolute league winner at the tight end position. And I don't know how you cannot start him going forward. It's kind of crazy. I know we got Mike Evans potentially coming back in 2 to 3 weeks. I don't know. There's going to be no Chris Godwin. So as much as like those targets are going to go to Mike Evans, but I still believe that Cade Otton can be a high 9, 10 target earner each and every week, which in the tight end landscape with how desolate it currently is, Cade Otton instantly bumps up as a top 3 tight end, absolute league winner if you've either stashed him or you picked him up when he started to pop off, and it's looking great because you just got an elite level tight end on the free off the waiver wire. So if you like fantasy football, if you like winning, hit that like and subscribe button. Going live on Friday night to answer all your start sit questions at 9 Eastern Standard Time. So make sure you come back for that. Check out these 2 videos if you haven't, and I'll catch you on the next one. Peace.